The ethical dilemma of free will and why ordinary people do bad things. The thesis is, I argue two things in this presentation. 1. Ordinary people are driven to do bad things due to the impact perceived threats have on their fight or flight response and sense of personal autonomy. 2. When people are driven to do bad things and their actions harm other people, they should be held accountable for the things they did because although they lacked autonomy, they made the conscious decision to commit an action that caused harm to someone, and for that, they should be punished. Free will versus autonomy. The differences. Free will is used to refer to the control we have over our physical actions and our ability to act on the decisions we make. Autonomy, however, is a word used for self-government or the ability for one to act on their own will. When people obey authority and do something that goes against their ethics, they are not acting with their own agency and therefore lack autonomy. Though they have free will, they are taking the actions they take due to fear, a threat, or something else. Conversations around autonomy often have to do with the notion of sexual ethics. An example of this would be if a man would have threatened to ruin aspects of a woman's life unless she granted him sexual favors. Looking at this scenario, we can drift the conversation to more severe cases where people in the military may be punished for their disobedience if they don't commit acts of violence. They have the free will to rebel against orders, but oftentimes don't because of the threat it could pose to their well-being. When people find themselves in these situations, it means they don't have full control over their own autonomy. Still, the violence that comes out of war would not exist if it weren't for the soldiers behind the guns. The psychology of obedience to authority. Obedience versus conformity. Obedience is characterized by following an order, while conformity involves complying with a request. Obedience typically involves following commands from someone of a higher status, whereas conformity involves aligning with peers of an equal status. So here, there is a difference in how people act and the things that they do and what the real causes of it are. Obedience is driven by social power, while conformity is driven by the desire for social acceptance. When we look at situations like the Holocaust, and as well as many other military situations, in this example, we're forced to ask the question of how so many people could commit such heinous acts and act like it was normal when they are in front of their families and stuff. The reason, if there is one, is because they believed they were somehow less responsible for the genocide because they were just one person doing what their fellow soldier was doing. These soldiers were not physically forced to kill people. They were simply ordered to. When millions of people kill people under the justification that they were not responsible for the genocide just because they were one person who was following the orders of their superiors, then who do we place the blame on for all these horrific things happening? Ordinary people have the psychological tendency to obey people with more powerful than them, but they have the physical ability to resist. Oftentimes when people fail to obey, oftentimes when people fall and become obedient due to intimidation, it is a subconscious thing and they don't realize that they are becoming obedient subjects. An example of this was in the Milgram experiment, which I will touch on later. Other times, it is due to a perceived lack of autonomy people have when threatened. An example of this is how soldiers act on the orders of their superiors in war. Factors that impact obedience. One factor is personality traits. Some personality characteristics, such as conscientiousness, agreeableness, have been associated with higher levels of obedience to authority figures. Another one is psychological distance. Individuals may be more inclined to obey authority when the consequences of their action feel distant, abstract, or unconnected to their personal life. So if a soldier in the military feels they can come home and it'll be like nothing happened, then that may indicate a level of psychological distance from the things they are doing when they're obeying orders. Another factor is ambiguity or lack of information. In situations lacking clarity, individuals may be more prone to obey someone who appears to possess more information than they do. Like in the military, when soldiers obey the higher ups, they oftentimes assume that they must know information about the enemy that would warrant an attack. But sometimes it's simply just an unwarranted attack and they're just the aggressors. But many of the soldiers don't quite realize the weight of what they're doing. So they're just simply extremely obedient. A final factor is fear of consequences. Obedience often stems from a fear of repercussions to disobedience. For instance, children may obey their parents or teachers due to the fear of punishment or the loss of privileges, or under other circumstances, like in the German side of World War II, Nazis claimed to obey their superiors out of fear that disobedience would cost them their position in the military and they wouldn't be able to support their family. Other soldiers would claim that it was due to fear of their lives. The Milgram experiment. One of psychology's most famous and controversial experiments, the Milgram experiment, had participants be instructed to administer electric shocks to a stranger at the behest of authority figure. Conducted by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s, this groundbreaking study aimed to explore the limits of obedience to authority and the human capacity to inflict harm on others. The Milgram experiment emerged in the aftermath of World War II, a time when the world was reeling from the actions of the Nazis as the Nuremberg trials played out. It raised questions about how seemingly ordinary individuals could commit such atrocities at such high rates, probing whether obedience to authority was the sole driver or if there were other forces at play. Participants were told that they were part of a study on punishment's effects on learning. As teachers, as they called it, they administered electric shocks to a learner for wrong answers. The learner was an actor, but they did not know that. No real shocks were ever given, but the participants also were unaware of that. The experiment tested the question of how much pain these ordinary people were willing to cause as they followed the orders of a scientist. The Milgram experiment results. The experiment started with the learner seated and the teacher instructed to administer escalating shocks for each incorrect answers. The shocks increased in intensity, potentially reaching lethal levels. If participants hesitated or showed concern, the experimenter, clad in a lab coat and holding a clipboard, would provide verbal prompts like, "The experiment requires you to continue," or "You have no choice, you must proceed." The outcome of this experiment was shocking. Surprisingly, a remarkable 65% of participants continued to administer shocks up to the maximum level of 450 volts, despite the learner's screams of pain and objection. Most participants obeyed the experimenter's instruction, even when they thought they were inflicting serious harm on another person and heard the screams of the learner. The Milgram experiment revealed the dark side of obedience and the influence of authority in persuading individuals to act against their moral principles. The research showed that ordinary people, under specific circumstances, could be compelled to harm others quite easily. This discovery challenged the prevalent notion that only inherently wicked individuals could commit heinous acts, and showed us that truly it is anyone that could. Now we get into the psychology of free will. Men think of themselves as free because they are conscious of their actions but ignorant of their causes. This is a quote by Branch Spinoza. You cannot talk about free will without also addressing the influence our mind has on our actions. When we are scared, a flight or fight response is triggered. In terms of how this influences our actions and free will, it's important to recognize that the fight or flight response can sometimes override our rational decision-making process. When faced with a perceived threat, our bodies prioritize survival, often leading us to act impulsively or irrationally. In these moments, our actions may be more driven by an instinct than by a conscious choice. When people are scared or even just threatened or intimidated, they often flee to what they feel is the safest option for them instead of following their personal ethics in their choices. It's like they're blindsided by personal feeling. This is why people oftentimes tie poor decisions to people feeling a loss of autonomy, and people tend to sympathize with others more when they say they did something because they were ordered to do it. People always have a sort of free will, but our minds influence us in a way that makes us easily obedient to those we see as more powerful than us. Although it is true that the mind influences us to do things that may not reflect our character, it is never an excuse for the evil actions people commit. The Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials were a series of military tribunals conducted by the Allied forces after World War II. Their purpose was to prosecute the key members of a political, military, and economic leadership of Nazi Germany. During these trials, the defense, including many leaders in Nazi Germany, continuously argued superior order in hopes of receiving lesser punishment. They made the claim that if they were not to commit these heinous acts, it could have harmed them, their families, and their lives. This is the mindset that many of the world's criminals have, that they have no choice and somehow lack the free will to act on their own behalf instead of on the orders of superior authority. This relates to the Milgram experiment as it demonstrates how easy it is, even in the real world, for people to commit evils even more severe than electric shocks out of obedience to authority. And these people were not always committing these heinous things. They were manipulated and influenced into it. And then as they did it, it became a part of them to the point where they excused it and acted like the pain they were causing people was nothing, when in reality, it was what the world would consider genocide. In this situation, we must look at the person as well as the consequences of their actions. All people's brains work in a way that makes disobedience to authority difficult. But if everyone surrenders their autonomy to act on behalf of these evil world powers, then it leads to that genocide. If we just allow this to continue, then the world is going to be even more of a mess than it already has been. There are many examples of people in war defying their own ethics to obey the orders of leaders. What makes this example especially chilling is that it led to one of the world's worst genocides that we know of. And this is my works cited page. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I made my point on how free will influences our choices and the evil that is throughout the world. Thank you very much.